Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone on the call. I am extremely honored to be giving a presentation to you all today called Phoenix Rising, 10 Predictions for 2017. My name is Dan Sommer. I head up the Market Intelligence unit at Qlik. And I'd like to give a big tip of the hat to James Richardson, who has done this presentation in previous years. Those are very, very big shoes to fill. I'll try my best to do fill them at least partially. It's called Phoenix Rising, which I'll go into shortly why it's called like that. But I think we can start by essentially looking at what the meta trends are out there, or the mega trends, or the really big tectonic shifts that we're experiencing. Because I think we're experiencing what could be likened to a big bang, essentially, where we're moving from centralization to more decentralized power, and from power to further empowerment out into the fringe. And I think it's occurring in 4 different areas in particular. It is certainly appearing from a data perspective, where we're experiencing an explosion and fragmentation of data and content. And I could put up a big data is exploding slide here, like every other presentation about digitization, analytics, and BI starts with, but I'll spare you. We're also experiencing significant distribution and empowerment when it comes to computing, where we see an explosion of computing and henceforth analytic power further and further out into the fringes of organizations and into the edges as well. And very much trailing this, we're also seeing increased access for individuals and organizations to really harness all of this power through the rise of new business models, such as freemium, such as the sharing economy that there's so much talk about, such as new ecosystems forming, which really gives much more access than we've had in the past. And we'll talk about that as well. And then the 4th explosion or big bang is happening in the area of usage, where we're experiencing a significant rise of what we could call information activism. The people in organizations that essentially can take all of this and wrangle it together and provide some sort of an output for the rest of us to consume. The only problem is that the first 3 trends that I spoke about, access, data, and computing, can grow in an exponential fashion and are growing in an exponential fashion, whereas usage is growing much more in a linear fashion. There simply isn't enough information activists out there, and the growth slope isn't as fast or as steep as for the other trends. So there's a gap forming, what we could call the data pollution gap or the data gap, because those information activists, there's just not enough of us in organizations that can do that, which means that the delta is widening between all of the data that is being created out there and our ability to consume it, because there's so much data coming out of that exhaust. Therefore, we're experiencing significant data pollution, where even good data gets polluted with bad data, and where there are so many different new data points coming in that you don't know what data sets you can trust and what data sets you cannot trust. And that means that, for example, in the ether and social media, there are all kinds of news that are spreading. I'll give you one example out of Sweden. All of a sudden, we had news everywhere around the globe that Sweden is adopting a 6-hour work week. And that was picked up by reputable news outlets as well, such as the BBC, The Guardian, and other outlets like that, because the news spreads so fast like a wildfire, and it's almost an impossible task to put these news out, even if they turn out to be incorrect. So how do we deal with all of this? Well, many of us deal with it with data bias, and it's also helped by algorithms from Google, from Facebook, and from other mechanisms like that, which essentially filter out the news so that we only focus on the things that we like or that often confirm the pre-existing biases that we already have, which is a very dangerous state to be in because we're kind of in an echo chamber of our own thinking and we're not being challenged enough. That could lead to data fatigue as well. And since we're speaking about fatigue, why not bring in the famous quote from Michael Gove when he essentially said that, and I'm paraphrasing him, we're sick and tired of experts. Meaning that we shouldn't be trusting economists anymore, but we should just go with the voice of the people. And it could also lead to data ignorance. And we're seeing this everywhere right now, where increasingly emotion is taking the upper hand over facts and statistics and rational thinking. And we are longing for a time when things were simpler, when things were easier without as much data as we have today. Which is, I think, why the Oxford Dictionary coined the word of the year for 2016 to be post-truth. So I call this the post-fact era. Just when we should have been ushered into a new enlightened age of facts in the digital age, we are struggling because of all of the different information that we have to consume and struggle to consume. Many of us lived through the elections that we just went through right now, and you might have recalled that there were fact checkers there, and they essentially found that upwards of 80% of the facts, so-called facts, that were spouted around in the election campaigns turned out to be completely incorrect. 80%. And by the way, we're not only seeing this in the public discourse, but we're also seeing it in organizations. Upwards of 2/3 of managers say that they would trust their gut instinct over facts, even if the facts contradict their instinct. So that's why we're coining 2016 the year of the information activist. We coined 2016 the year of information activism. This is the data engineers, the data scientists, this is the business analysts, the citizen data scientists, etc. The people that can really take all of that data and do something useful with it. And it's growing. And these are the new aristocrats in organizations, commanding high salaries and taking more and more prestigious positions. However, it's not enough. So therefore, in 2017, we're coining that year the year of data literacy, which essentially means spreading analytics, spreading insights and data literacy to the broader populace in organizations. Because just like literacy 100 years ago, we need to go from data literacy being a nice to have to an absolute must have. Because 100 years ago, regular literacy, i.e. reading and writing, wasn't something that you needed to have when you were out on the farm, for example, working with agriculture. But as the economy shifted towards a more services-driven, towards a more urban, industrial economy, literacy very, very quickly pivoted to something that is an absolutely essential thing to know for survival. And I think we'll experience something similar very, very soon when it comes to data literacy as well. And I think that is the only answer to the post-fact era. So lucky for us, I think 2017 will really be the year when we see a number of different trends starting to intersect and confluence with one another, meaning that we'll start that very, very painful journey from post-fact upwards towards the slope of enlightenment and data literacy. I'm not saying that we'll reach data literacy in 2017. I'm saying that these 10 trends will help us unlock Phoenix, and Phoenix can start rising from the ashes towards a more enlightened age. So let me go through these 10 trends one by one. I think it would be useful, as we're speaking about the first trend, to really speak about what data literacy is. What is the definition of data literacy? Well, I'm going to borrow MIT and Emerson University's definition. They talk about data literacy being the ability to read, work with, analyze, and argue with data. Reading essentially entails understanding what data is and what aspects of the world it represents. Working with data involves creating, acquiring, cleaning, and managing that data. And analyzing involves what we're used to, the filtering, the sorting, aggregating, comparing, and performing other analytic operations. And then we have the final piece, which is arguing with data, which really involves supporting a larger narrative intended to communicate some sort of a message to a particular audience. Very, very important. Because if there's something we've learned in 2016, it is that emotions very often win over facts. And rational thinking very often gets trumped by gut feel. So the good news is, I think the first trend for 2017 that I talked about is that the concept of visualization will move from only analysis to that whole chain of information that contains all of those components. Read, work with, analyze, and argue with data. Because when it comes to read and actually bring in different data, I think it's much easier to map out an ecosystem of different data sources that exist in different places. We have better data semantics that can bring in data and provide similar data models for them. We have data catalogs and portals that can help you with information asset management. And we have improved semantics that you can, for example, overlay on top of enterprise data lakes. All of these help you with the ability to read data. Then, of course, visualization is increasingly moving downstream also to the data preparation layer. Because data preparation shouldn't just be about looking at the raw data, but data preparation is often where the analysis starts. And we're seeing a budding industry forming around the whole area of self-service data prep as more and more individuals want to get empowered with doing also that in a world where data is fragmented. Then, of course, we have visual analysis, where visualization has lived for a long time. And even here we're seeing this being a very living organism with a lot of innovation happening. For example, libraries where you can access multiple new visualizations, but also innovation when it comes to the art of visualization. For example, rendering huge data sets on large screens. But there's also the fourth component here, which is storytelling and collaboration. And as I spoke about, this is an extremely important step, because if you don't have that and you're not subjective and can argue with the data correctly, I think the alternative is that people argue without data. So therefore, having improved storytelling and collaborative features and more visualization around that, which will come in 2017, you can start closing the loop all the way from reading, but also through working, analyzing, and arguing with the data. And it becomes a virtuous cycle. So what does that really unlock for us? Well, it makes it easier to visualize and trust the whole information supply chain. And trust is a key word here, because if you're holding the data from bringing it in, to wrangling it, to analyzing it, and then telling stories with it, it provides a whole different level of trust. And it can make the data come alive to a much larger extent. That brings us to the second trend, which is also about making data come alive. Because I think that improved semantics will really shift the big data discussion in 2017 from one of size to increasingly one of combinations. Because let's be critical here. If we go back the last 3 to 5 years on the whole big data hype, I think we can say that the first wave of big data hasn't been as successful as we expected. And I think this very much has to do with the fact that throwing data into a lake or just hoarding data for no clear purpose, it simply has proved too inefficient in many cases. And actually, Gartner does validate this by saying that through 2018, 90% of deployed data lakes will be useless as they're overwhelmed with information assets captured for uncertain use cases. And frankly, most of the value isn't in the size of the data, but it's in data combinations. I go back to my days at Gartner where they had something called the art of the possible, where colleagues of mine were looking at really successful use cases in different industries. And what was really striking there, that it was very, very rarely about huge data sets. But most of the innovation often came in interesting and innovative combinations of the data. So what then is the triggering event for 2017? Well, as more and more data is becoming cloud-based, as more and more of the data is fragmented and external, it turns out that it often is quite easy to build the data models in such a world, where you're building the data models once based on these external data sources, and it can often be standardized and reused multiple times if you have some sort of a mechanism or portal that can bring in that external data. So I think we'll see, because of that, improved semantics, shifting the big data discussion from size to combinations. And what that really unlocks for us is that big data analytics become much more agile, much more solution-oriented, and really raising the art of the possible and providing better data quality as well, because if we do those combinations, we can see the outliers. We can see if a data source is polluted, as one example. Right. That brings us to our third prediction, which is around cloud reaching a tipping point of 50% adoption plans. But it will be unevenly distributed. So I've seen a lot of adoption statistics here lately, both from BARC and from Gartner and from other research houses, and they seem to be fairly consistent with one another, which essentially means that even though cloud-based analytics is a small portion of the market, there's actually, from an adoption perspective, we're nearing some sort of a tipping point at organizations either starting to deploying it in a small scale or planning to deploy it. And that tipping point of 50%, I think, will come in 2017. I think it's between 40 and 50% in 2016. But what I mean by unevenly distributed is that there are quite significant geographic variances here. So where the US is ahead of the curve and North America in general, the European and especially Central European and Eastern European parts are much more conservative. So I recently did a tour of what we call Visualizer World, which is Qlik's roadshow. And I often made a point of asking the audience and polling the audience what proportion were actually using cloud-based analytics today. And it turned out that in many countries like Poland and like Germany, for example, only a handful went up out of hundreds of hands. So it's still very unevenly distributed for varying reasons, regulatory, privacy reasons, etc. It's also unevenly distributed when it comes to the BI front end versus the data warehousing aspect. So cloud-based data warehousing is 15 to 20 percentage points behind when it comes to adoption, when it compares to the actual BI front end. Because I think those enterprise data warehouses that we've spent decades curating and frankly is running our business is the last one that we'll replace. And therefore, and that won't tip to the cloud as quickly. This is often referred to as data gravity. And then the final point about work group and enterprise. Of course, on a personal level or on a work group level, adoption is much more rapid because you're often bringing in new data sets, and it's that quick instance that you can set up versus wall-to-wall enterprise deployments, which are still significantly behind the curve here. So what that really unlocks for us is that cloud acceptance, when we get to that tipping point and beyond, is going to remove the startup cost. It's going to be much quicker to set something up. It's going to provide scale in an easier fashion than what we've had in the on-premise world, and therefore it can spread more quickly and provide more data literacy. So the fourth trend is about 2017 really moving that discussion about advanced analysis to advancing analytics. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I think data scientists, as we all know, is a very cherished and prized asset in organizations. Unfortunately, we're struggling to make them grow on trees, and we're struggling to clone them as well, and there simply aren't enough of those high-end information activists called data scientists. And they should probably build the models and curate the models and oversee those algorithms and models themselves, because governance of the models is as important as governance of data. But that doesn't hinder the rest of us to use those models through bringing them into self-service data discovery and visualization tools. So I think we'll see much more democratization where we can use the models that these experts have built. The other piece I see here is, of course, machine learning. And there's clearly going on a lot in the area of artificial intelligence. Deep learning, machine learning, etc. is on everyone's lips. And you could argue it's the new big data from a hype perspective, just heading up to the peak of inflated expectations. Actually, research firm CB Insights reports that just in the first quarter of 2016, there were 140 AI firms created, which brings the total tally to upwards of between 2,000 and 3,000 AI firms. And there's a lot of mergers and acquisitions activity here as well. So what can we do with machine learning? Well, we can essentially use that to crawl those huge data sets out there to essentially bring in more smarts around the data preparation phase that we spoke about, but also finding patterns and sharing findings. But it shouldn't be a black box. So it can recommend things for us, but we want to oversee that ourselves, and we want to have that lineage. Remember what I spoke about when we spoke about data literacy, all the way back to the data. And that's extremely important, and that's where the human reasoning and the human questioning component comes in, and the exploration phase. Because the less routine a decision becomes, the more important human reasoning and questioning is. That non-linear thinking, that synthesis, not just analysis, that we want to have, and that strategic thinking that we're still so good at. So these three, essentially in combination with one another, will democratize a lot of the advanced analysis and helping us advance analytics to the broader populace much more, because the sweet spot between those three are augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. And I'd like to quote Kevin Kelly here, who essentially asked whether it is the professional chess player like Kasparov or the machine like Deep Blue that is the most powerful one. Well, the answer is it's the combination of those two together. It's man and machine, which trumps even artificial intelligence. So what that brings for us is more and quicker time to insight, with more predictive analytics being able to use, and more smarts around data prep, finding patterns, and sharing findings. So the next trend is, I think, a very interesting one. I have a son who plays Pokemon Go pretty much all the time. And it really is, in my opinion now, the next step change after mobility. And I think we currently are seeing that this will be the next catalyst for innovation. And I would argue that many organizations right now, many innovation labs, strategists, are currently sitting in their labs and really thinking about how they can replicate Pokemon Go and do something similar for their business, where the digital and the physical worlds are beginning to meet in analytics. So really Pokemon Go is the catalyst here, if you like. Now, one industry that I see has actually risen to the occasion is the automotive industry. And I'm thinking of big firms like Ford, Jaguar, Volvo, and BMW. Because what they're essentially taking, not just to the dashboard of your car, but essentially to the windscreen of your car increasingly, providing more and more immersive experiences where, frankly, there is no rationale why that windscreen of your car can't be both providing if you should be leaving earlier from your office because there's a lot of traffic, or whether you want to stop by in the store next to you because it has a big sale going on right now, etc., etc. That huge piece of real estate can be used for so many different things, essentially combining the digital and the physical worlds. So we'll see more of those type of use cases as we move into 2017, with really Pokemon Go being the trigger and the catalyst. And of course, innovations like geospatial, augmented reality, and IoT is going to help contextualize analytics for the physical world and really capturing those moments and therefore spread it to more of us. The next trend I see is around the area of self-service visualization, especially desktop-based visualization. I think in 2017, there's going to be even more push towards that becoming a commodity, accessible for all. Because let's take a trip down memory lane and really look at how software has been procured, how software has been purchased. And now we're really speaking about that accessibility point that I started on. Because it very often had to do with IT having to rubber stamp everything because of the complexity and the time it took to implement. And enterprise license agreements were really the norm of how you brought software into an organization, and then it was pushed out from a one-to-many type of approach. Then we saw the emergence of, especially in memory and self-contained architectures that could be deployed in a few-to-many approach, where departmental heads and shadow IT started bringing in their own stacks, analytics stacks, and deploying them on a departmental level. So we could call that expanse. Then we moved from there to what could be called lands, where these illustrious information activists, like business analysts, like data scientists, like data engineers, etc., brought in their own analytical tools, which they then spread to a few people in the sort of user ecosystem around them. So we could call this approach many to few, but it still had a significant cost to it. I think what we've seen and will increasingly see now in 2017 is essentially that freemium becomes the completely and all dominating model, as there are so many different vendors that are providing better and better tools that are completely free on a desktop level that anyone can get started with and start getting that personal analytics and therefore begin on that slope from post-fact to increasingly data literacy and perhaps even information activism. That barrier of entry has essentially been removed now. And I call this phase the personal analytics phase, which essentially means that more people can do analysis not just for their boss, but also to serve their own purposes. But I think personal analytics also has another dimension, which is that we will increasingly be able to collect information about individuals and therefore have much more of a segment of one type of approach for how people are essentially behaving and using tools, etc. So therefore, having a laser focus on the customer and really providing that immersive experience for the customer is what's going to win out in this particular phase. So that brings us to the next trend, which very much is a function of the previous trend, and that is that modern BI overtakes traditional BI as the new reference architecture, because that trip down memory lane that we took earlier essentially talks about how the BI market has also evolved. So we used to have red and blue and other colored stacks that were deeply entrenched with the IT department, and then we moved on to not just provide that, but also to have more departmental tools, and then those tools for the information activists. And now we're in this phase where personal analytics can dominate. And what we therefore see is a pivot from an inside-out perspective to an outside-in perspective. And if there's anything that confirms this, it is the 2016 Magic Quadrant from Gartner, where essentially modern BI really started sitting alongside and increasingly overtaking traditional BI as the new normal, if you like. And what they essentially talked about, and I'm paraphrasing again, is that analytics need to be user-driven. Analytics need to be driven from the business, but we now also need to scale it much more than what has been required previously. Much as a victim of its own success, I think the next phase will be essentially separating the men from the boys, if I may express it like that, where those type of data discovery tools and modern BI tools that can scale, that can combine multiple data sources with one another, that can provide relevant areas and sufficient areas of governance so that both agility and governance is provided, is going to be the next reference architecture. So I think in 2017 we'll see a further evolution of that, where modern BI isn't just sitting alongside traditional BI, but increasingly starting to replace archaic BI tools. And what that really enables for us, of course, is more self-service, more discovery that can scale on a more enterprise type of fashion, which means that more people can use it. Okay, so we've spoken kind of about the evolution of the BI market and how it will further evolve in 2017. We've seen that whereas traditional BI has often only reached a minority stake in organizations, in particular the specialists and the management layers that can consume those type of reports, we've seen modern BI in particular go much, much deeper in organizations and reach those information activists, but also data literates as we move into new business models. But that still isn't enough, because not everyone wants to be both a producer and a consumer of applications. Many people, if I may call them information workers, that perhaps aren't as skilled or not interested in creating their own applications, they still want to have a rich exploration experience. So therefore, it's going to be increasingly important, I think, to provide data-driven, custom applications that can be quickly built, but also increasingly providing analytics in the applications and in the operational context where people are working. So you're not just reaching the information workers, but increasingly also what we could call workers with information, or operational workers. And as we go through this transition, and as we right-size analytics for different constituents in an organization, we also see a significant shift here and a transition where we move from analytics being a destination to much more analytics coming to you into the context, into the world that you live in, and touching you, if not hundreds, but then thousands of times every day. And through getting through that transition where you move from analytics as a destination to increasingly analytics coming to you, that's how we'll reach that other half that hasn't necessarily had a rich analytic experience. in the past. So therefore, in 2017, we'll see significant moves here as well, where the focus will shift from custom analytic applications to also analytics in the application. And as that is happening, of course, we'll see that distribution that we spoke about and started the presentation with. More distribution and fragmentation of data, more distribution and fragmentation of compute, more people using analytic tools in different contexts, and new ecosystems forming. Now, that's all well and good if we're making that transition and progress towards more data literate people, but it also means significant distribution and many different analytical nodes and centers of excellence in an organization. And therefore, ecosystems will really need to come in and prove their strength in 2017, because ecosystems is what's going to be that connective tissue and provide that networked experience for all of the different nodes that are being created in organizations. And I think networks and connections of, in particular, data, people, and ideas will evolve. So what do I mean by that then? Well, data is about combining fragmented and multiple data sources. It's also about portals that can map out what data can be trusted and what data can't be trusted. And it's also about, in connecting that data, we can more clearly see what data is accurate, what data is less accurate. So the governance and the data quality is in the fragmentation and in the distribution, in the network. We also will see connecting much more people, where we right-size the analytics for different individuals and essentially tap into wisdom of the crowds, where essentially we come to the conclusion that none of us is as smart as all of us. And if we can tap into the brains of all of the people in an organization, but then hopefully graduate some of the findings and some of the insights of those individuals from that personal analytic use case all the way up to the enterprise, is the way to really maximize innovation and insights. And you want to capture those ideas. You want to reuse them. You want to graduate them. You therefore really need to have a strong partner ecosystem and a community and an ecosystem that can really help harness all of those ideas. So I think that's increasingly going to become an important component in a hyper-competitive market. And I think much as a function of what I've been speaking about today, I think it's increasingly clear that in 2017, hybrid and multi-environment will be the dominant model that emerges. So we'll move from a state where it has to be either or to one of and, where you can do both. This goes for data, where you really want to do those quick data combinations. You want to look at internal data. You really want to mash that up with external data, because data without external context is, in a fragmented world, is increasingly irrelevant. You really want to do compute along a number of different stages, both on-premise, but also in public and private clouds, but also increasingly on the edge, especially with the emergence of IoT, for example. You want to, as we've spoken about, have many different approaches, from one to many, where you centrally publish, especially systems of record type of applications, but also embedded into the workflows and processes where people live, but also allow personal analytics, where individuals can create their own applications in a much more seamless and easy fashion. So user expansion is also happening. And then, of course, as we spoke about, you want to have those open, elastic platforms that can grow from an enterprise, that can grow from a work group all the way up to an enterprise, should it need to, and provide both that openness, but also the security and the governance on the back end. So therefore, those vendors that only provide, for example, a cloud-based tool and not a hybrid model, or those vendors that only provide an on-premises tool and can't tap into these hybrid environment will increasingly struggle, I think, in 2017. So that was it. Those were the 10 trends that I've observed that I think will help us in 2017 and start us on that journey to move us from the state that we're in right now, the post-fact, to one of a more enlightened, fact and data-driven data literacy era. And let me repeat what those 10 trends are. The first one is about that information supply chain, where we're going to move from visual analysis only to the whole information supply chain. The second is about really data combinations becoming increasingly easier as semantics and data models are becoming more and more standardized, especially as we're moving to more and more external data. That's going to help us move the discussion from one of big data to increasingly one of combinations of data, because the reality is that combinations of data eats big data for breakfast. We'll also see cloud reaching a tipping point in 2017 where organizations will either deploy or plan to deploy cloud in a much bigger extent than what we've seen previously. And that could help accelerate that adoption towards the cloud, which will help from a data literacy perspective. We'll see advanced analytics really moving more towards advancing analytics for the broader populace through things like bringing data models into self-service tools and through things like machine learning, but also bringing the human component in that can help explore thanks to the other advanced analytics that we're bringing in. And that combination of those three, I think, really is the sweet spot that will bring us towards augmented intelligence, which trumps artificial intelligence. We'll experience a shift where we'll see these two worlds, the physical worlds and the digital worlds, increasingly being merged with one another. And Pokemon Go really was the trigger there, which is now catalyzing a whole bunch of different other ideas which will spawn from that. We see the worlds of especially desktop-based visualization to increasingly become available for everyone as we're moving to a business model which is much more around freemium. So therefore, charging thousands of dollars for a desktop-based visualization tool is a fool's errand in this world. We see modern BI increasingly becoming the reference architecture, not just sitting alongside traditional BI, but increasingly being the reference architecture that can provide both flexibility and scale and governance at the same time. We'll see more and more the analytics not just being a destination, but increasingly coming to you. And that is helped by especially custom analytic applications, but also analytics in the application, which will help us move from not just the specialists and the information activists, but increasingly providing data literacy also to information workers and workers with information. And then in this world of distribution, ecosystems will need to prove their strength in 2017. So that's ecosystems of data, ecosystems of people, and ecosystems of ideas in particular. Moving us from all of those analytical nodes increasingly to networks. And that really is the case in point why a world of hybrid will become more and more dominating, and the world of multi-platform, where we're going from a state of either or, a binary state, to increasingly one where we can do and. So we can do internal and external data. We can do on-premise, cloud, and edge computing. We can do central publishing and personal analytics. And we can provide openness and security, both of them. So those were my 10 trends, which I think will help Phoenix rise from the ashes increasingly. Thank you very much for listening, and I think, I'm looking at the clock here, we have time for a few questions that are just coming through in the feed as we're speaking. Right, let me see. So I got one question about data storytelling and why it is so difficult, and how will you see anyone being able to do that? Well, I think what we need to do just with data storytelling is the same as with analytics in general. We need to right size it and demystify it. So some people want to read the Dostoevsky book. Some people want to essentially just read some piece of fiction. It's the same thing with storytelling. So I think there is a budding new job title out there, which is called data artisan or data journalist or data storyteller, etc. What they really can do, they are the pros. They can build all kinds of visualizations on top of an open platform, and therefore really provide, for example, how people are moving through a hospital or other logistical areas like that, and really provide a deep story around that. So that's the advanced Dostoevsky book that some people want to read. Other people simply just want to improve a way of narrating the findings that they have in front of them, and therefore a tight lineage between the visualization and analytical tool that you are using, but also with the self-service data prep and the ability to read data. I think that closed loop and the iteration that should be quick there will be able to provide more data storytelling for more people. Right. If I see any longer term and more contrarian trends, okay, so when I speak about 2017 trends, I'm not necessarily bringing in the more sort of the more futuristic visions here, but what I can tell you that I'm sort of dabbling with is what does browsing with no screen mean? What does visualization going away essentially mean? Well, I think that's something that we need to think about as more and more web browsing sessions are done without a screen. So clearly the area of voice, the area of natural language will have to come in much more strongly than what we're used to here. So that's certainly one area. What's visualization's role in that world? Well, I think visualization will increasingly less be about the end result, but more about the context of your findings. So you might, in a world of extremely quick data crawling and combinations of data, be able to ask questions and get to an answer immediately, but you might want to ask the next question, and you might want to sort of clap your hand and say, show me, or something like that, and then the visualizations render around that data point that you've found. So it's going to be much more about providing that context, which is super important, of course, around the answer. The other thing that I'm increasingly thinking about, and I haven't arrived at an answer yet, so I'd be curious to hear from you on the call if you have any thoughts around this, is will data decline? Because more and more data will not be stored. More and more data will be transient, especially with IoT, right, where you're not going to store that data. So it's interesting in a world of algorithms and IoT, etc., whether we're going to stop hoarding data really speaking far out in the future. I haven't arrived at an answer yet. I'd be curious to hear what you're thinking. So those are some things I'm thinking around. Right. Next question. Right. We'll stop there. Those are what I have at the moment, and I think our time is running as well. I'd like to thank you for your patience. I hope I provided some interesting perspectives for you. I'd be curious to hear what you think. Are we moving to the age of data literacy increasingly? And thank you very much. Have a great rest of the day.